The crack echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. A young black boy fell sideways in his seat, his jaw broken by the very person meant to keep passengers safe, a flight attendant. Gasps rippled through the rows as travelers froze in disbelief. No one could understand how such brutality had erupted in the middle of a routine flight. But what the flight attendant didn't realize was that just a few seats away, a federal judge had witnessed every second. And in that moment, the entire flight and the airline itself was about to be turned upside down. Before the chaos unfolded, it was an ordinary afternoon in the sky. Families buckled in, business travelers tapped on their laptops, and flight attendants moved down the aisle with practiced precision. Among the passengers sat a boy no older than 13. He was shy, clutching his backpack to his chest, his wide eyes filled with the quiet excitement of flying. For him, this wasn't just a trip, it was an adventure, a memory he hoped would last forever. He had boarded the plane with everything in order, his ticket scanned, his seat assigned, his manners impeccable. But from the moment he stepped on board, there had been tension. A flight attendant's sharp glance lingered too long, her tone curt and dismissive whenever she addressed him. To most, it might have seemed like routine stress from a busy flight, but to the boy it felt like something deeper, an unspoken hostility he couldn't explain. Still, he tried to keep his head down, obeying instructions, adjusting his seatbelt, whispering, "Yes, ma'am," whenever spoken to. He wanted no trouble. But prejudice has a way of finding its mark, even when the target does nothing wrong. A few rows back, unnoticed by most, sat a man in a tailored suit, his glasses perched neatly on his nose. He looked like any other professional traveler, calm and collected. What few realized was that he carried more authority than anyone else on board. He was a federal judge, a man sworn to uphold justice. And soon, he would witness an act so shocking, so blatant, that the weight of the law itself would be called into play. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but beneath the routine, something darker was brewing, something that would shatter more than just the quiet of the flight. The first signs of trouble seemed small. The boy asked politely for a blanket when the cabin grew cold. The flight attendant's response was sharp, dismissive. "You'll have to wait." Minutes later, when he requested water, her glare silenced him before she finally returned with a cup, placing it down so roughly that it spilled into his lap. A few passengers noticed, frowning at the unnecessary hostility, but most kept their eyes down. After all, who wanted to get involved in someone else's problem at 30,000 feet? The boy shifted uncomfortably, trying to clean himself with a napkin, cheeks burning with embarrassment. He had done nothing wrong, yet every interaction with the attendant made him feel smaller, more out of place. His hands shook as he tried to steady himself. All he wanted was to disappear into the background. But the cruelty wasn't finished yet. As meal service began, the attendant skipped his row entirely. Confused, the boy raised his hand timidly, asking if he had been missed. Her reply was cutting, delivered loud enough for others nearby to hear, "Maybe if you learned to behave, you wouldn't be ignored." Laughter rippled from a few seats, not out of malice, but out of awkwardness, people unsure how to react to the venom in her voice. But the humiliation pierced deeper than words. The judge, sitting 3 rows back, had been watching quietly. His trained eye caught the subtle shifts in tone, the pattern of aggression directed only at this child. He leaned forward slightly, his instincts telling him something was building, something he could not yet stop but would soon be forced to confront. The boy tried to keep still, pressing his lips together to hold back tears. But then came the breaking point. A small misunderstanding. He had stood up to adjust his bag in the overhead compartment while the seatbelt sign was still on. The flight attendant stormed down the aisle, her voice raised. She accused him of disrupting safety, her words dripping with exaggerated fury, as if his tiny act were a threat to the entire plane. Passengers turned their heads, their curiosity feeding the spectacle. The boy stammered, trying to explain, but before he could finish, the attendant leaned in close, her face twisted with anger. And then, in a moment so sudden it shocked even her colleagues, her hand struck with brutal force. A sickening crack filled the air. The boy collapsed back into his seat, clutching his face, a cry of pain breaking through the stunned silence. The cabin erupted. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of passengers rising to their feet. Some demanded to know what had happened. Others rushed forward, horrified by the sight of a child writhing in pain. Blood trickled from his mouth, his jaw already swelling grotesquely. The flight attendant froze, her own shock mixing with defiance. She muttered something about discipline, about safety protocols, but her words rang hollow against the undeniable violence of what had just occurred. The judge stood slowly, his presence commanding without a single word. He moved down the aisle, his eyes fixed on the boy, then on the woman who had struck him. In that instant, the power dynamic shifted. This was no longer just about an unruly flight or a harsh attendant. This was a crime, a brutal act of assault, witnessed by dozens, carried out against a defenseless child. Passengers began recording, phones held high. The hum of engines was drowned out by the rising storm of voices, the atmosphere electric with disbelief and anger. The boy, trembling and broken, became the center of a storm that would soon reach far beyond the walls of the aircraft. And as the judge knelt beside him, speaking softly to reassure the child, one thought crystallized in the minds of everyone watching. This flight was no longer about reaching its destination. It was about justice. The air inside the cabin was no longer calm. Every passenger could feel it, the weight of something extraordinary pressing against the fragile order of the flight. The boy sat slumped in his seat, his small hands trembling as they clutched his jaw, blood staining his shirt. His cries were muffled, broken, as though even his pain had been silenced by the violence done to him. The flight attendant stood rigid, her chest heaving, eyes darting around as if searching for some invisible ally who might justify her actions. But all she found were the burning stares of witnesses, cameras raised, mouths agape in disbelief. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs into outrage. "You hit a child!" someone shouted from the back. Another voice followed. "We all saw it." A woman near the aisle held her phone high, live-streaming the chaos, her voice trembling as she narrated, "She just broke his jaw. We're on flight 327, and this is happening right now." The flight attendant tried to reclaim control, her voice sharp, trembling. He was endangering safety. But the words collapsed under the weight of the truth that hung in the air. Safety. The boy could barely stand. The danger had not come from him, but from the uniform meant to protect. And then, the moment that would seal her fate. The judge stepped forward. He was calm, deliberate, his presence commanding the silence of the crowd. In that instant, it was as though the entire aircraft shifted. Every gaze followed him. He knelt beside the boy, gently tilting his chin to assess the injury, his hands steady with the practiced care of someone used to weighing evidence, to distinguishing lies from truth. His voice, deep and measured, cut through the uproar. "This is not discipline. This is assault." The words landed like a gavel striking wood. The authority in his tone was unmistakable, his judgment absolute. The flight attendant's face drained of color. "Sir, you don't understand," she began, but the judge rose to his full height, his eyes locking onto hers with a sharpness that could strip away every pretense. "I understand perfectly," he interrupted, his voice carrying across every row. "I am a federal judge, and I just witnessed a violent crime committed on a minor in my presence." The effect was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The passengers erupted, not in panic, but in a roar of vindication. They weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses to history. The attendant stumbled backward, her authority evaporating. Another crew member rushed forward, whispering frantically, urging her to step aside, but it was too late. The moment had shifted irreversibly. The judge turned to the stunned passengers. "Everyone stay calm. This boy will be protected, and justice will be served the moment we land." Phones kept recording, the digital evidence multiplying by the second, spreading far beyond the walls of the aircraft. Millions would soon see the truth. The boy, his face swollen and bruised, looked up at the judge with wide, tear-filled eyes. For the first time since the nightmare began, he saw not cruelty, not indifference, but strength standing in his corner. The attendant, cornered and pale, tried one final defense. "You can't. This isn't your courtroom." The judge's reply was cold, precise, and final. "Justice doesn't wait for a courtroom. It begins the moment a crime is witnessed." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the engines seemed muted beneath the weight of those words. And in that suspended moment, everyone on board realized the truth. This flight had become more than a journey through the skies. It had become a battleground for dignity, for justice, for the protection of the powerless. And as the boy clutched the judge's hand, trembling but no longer alone, the climax reached its full force. This was no longer a story of a cruel attendant and a helpless child. It was the story of a nation's conscience being awakened at 30,000 feet. The wheels of the plane screeched as they touched down on the runway. What should have been a routine landing now felt like the conclusion of a trial that had taken place midair. Passengers sat in tense silence, phones still recording, eyes darting between the injured boy and the man who had stood up for him, the federal judge whose words still echoed in their minds. The moment the seatbelt light went off, the judge instructed calmly, "Everyone remain seated. Authorities will handle this from here." His tone was firm, carrying the authority of the bench, even though this was no courtroom. No one dared to move. No one dared to break the sanctity of what had unfolded. Through the cabin windows, flashing blue and red lights could already be seen gathering near the gate. Police vehicles lined the tarmac like soldiers prepared for battle. The flight attendant, once so sure of her authority, now sat trembling in the jump seat, her hands clasped together, eyes darting around for sympathy, but finding only condemnation. The boy was escorted carefully by paramedics who rushed aboard the plane. His jaw was swollen, his breathing shallow, but he clung tightly to the judge's hand, refusing to let go. The sight brought tears to more than one passenger. This wasn't just an injury. It was a symbol of a deep wound carried by countless others who had been silenced before. But tonight, silence had broken. As the paramedics secured the boy, the captain himself stepped out of the cockpit, his expression grim. He approached the judge and said, "Sir, law enforcement is ready outside." "They've been briefed." The judge nodded, his gaze steady. "Make sure they know the child's safety is the first priority. Nothing else comes before that." When the door opened, officers boarded, and the cabin filled with the heavy presence of justice. One officer stepped forward, reading from a notepad. "We've received multiple complaints, and video evidence has already been transmitted. Ma'am, you're under arrest for aggravated assault on a minor." Gasps filled the air again. Passengers began clapping, not out of joy, but out of relief, out of vindication. The flight attendant tried to protest, her words tumbling over each other in desperation. "It was procedure." He wouldn't listen. "I didn't mean to." But the handcuffs clicked shut, the cold metal sealing her fate. Her pleas drowned beneath the weight of the truth that had already spread across social media. Millions had seen the live streams. Millions had judged her already. The boy was carried down the aisle on a stretcher, but not before the judge leaned close and whispered, "You're not alone anymore. The law will protect you." The boy, his eyes swollen with pain, nodded weakly, but in that small gesture was the spark of something larger, faith being restored. Outside, the terminal was flooded with reporters. Word had spread faster than the plane could fly. Headlines blazed across screens. Flight attendant assaults black child in midair. Federal judge intervenes. Microphones swarmed, cameras flashed, but the judge moved steadily, shielding the boy from the chaos as the paramedics guided him through. In the days that followed, the incident would dominate national news. Courtrooms would fill, lawyers would argue, and the videos captured by passengers would play over and over again for the world to see. The airline issued statements, scrambling to control the damage, but nothing could erase the raw truth that had been broadcast live from 30,000 feet in the sky. The flight attendant faced charges that could end not only her career, but her freedom. The airline faced lawsuits, protests, and a reckoning that would force them to examine the very culture of authority that allowed one employee to believe she could strike a defenseless child without consequence. But most of all, the story ignited something far greater than corporate apologies. It sparked conversations across the nation about race, about power, about the thin line between authority and abuse. Parents spoke about protecting their children, civil rights leaders demanded accountability, and lawmakers pointed to the bravery of a single judge who refused to remain silent. The boy's face, once bruised and battered, became a symbol, not just of suffering, but of resilience. His recovery was long, but it was never endured in silence. Communities rallied around him. Strangers sent letters, gifts, prayers. His story became a beacon for others who had endured similar cruelty in the shadows, unseen and unheard. And the judge? His role was hailed as heroic, but he never sought praise. When asked by reporters why he had intervened, his answer was simple, resolute. Because justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins the moment someone stands up and refuses to let wrong go unanswered. That single statement, recorded and replayed endlessly, became etched in memory, a reminder that justice is not distant, not delayed, not confined to marble halls and wooden benches. It lives in the courage of those who act when others hesitate. The resolution of this flight was more than the arrest of one attendant or the protection of one child. It was the awakening of a truth. That dignity and justice travel with us everywhere, even 30,000 feet above the earth. And on that night aboard Flight 327, the world saw it unfold. A child saved, a system challenged, and a nation reminded that silence in the face of cruelty is never an option.